Well, garage again, because I'm trying to fix some of the things I was fixing on the cat yard, which have broken because apparently we now have a stormy season, not a windy season. No, we don't have a stormy season. We don't have a windy season. It's windy all the time, but we don't have a stormy season either. No, we have a storm season, storm flat out, and it's pissing me off. Everything gets destroyed with a few months space between it. A few months interval, that's the right way to say it. But yeah, I'm just nursing some injuries while I'm waiting for some stuff to charge so I can continue the repairs, and I thought I'd do some recording in the meantime. I've got an injured pinky finger and an injured pinky toe and a very, very bruised pinky pride. So yeah, not the craftsman I'd like to be. But this isn't about craft, this is about, well, it's about another craft. And I'm continuing the whole relation thing because we had personal relations yesterday. That sounds wrong. I talked about personal relations between persons yesterday, individuals. So today I'd like to talk about relations between groups, or what I'd like to call factions, because a group can just be 2 or 3 people together. But a faction is any group of people that have some kind of thing to be a group about, some kind of focus, and likely some kind of rules, either written or unwritten, about behavior and about why everybody's there. The typical faction is a corporation or a guild or a trade house or some kind of other business-like structure, or perhaps a religion or cult or the like, organized belief of some kind. Anything that has a real internal, probably hierarchy. Some can be more original than just top-down hierarchy, but something like it. They likely have leaders in some kind of form or another. They probably have some rules. They have stated missions or goals or whatever. And they have some kind of internal culture, no matter how crude or unoriginal it might be. I know that every big corporation likes to talk about, oh, we have our own corporate culture here. Yeah, well, there's corporate culture, and you have a shallow copy of that most of the time. But it is still some kind of internal culture. It's a way people expect other people to behave within the group, within the faction. But factions can also be, for example, ethnicities. Some people on the savannah or the steppes or in the mountains that are considered one people, even though they don't have a national government in the usual sense. But they have a culture and they have people they look up to and the like. It could also be a fan group for some kind of celebrity or for some kind of some genre of entertainment. Anime fans can seem like a faction, although they have factions within them, I know. The fans of different pop stars or even pop genres. Beyonce's fans can almost be considered a faction. So can K-pop fans. Um, which is a bit broader. But fans of an idol who have a shared knowledge and love of the idol can function as a faction, especially if they have some kind of ongoing communication. In our day and age, the internet, in other times, it could be simply regular meetings or people basing their friend groups around uh, a specific interest of theirs, like a fan group. It can also be a family, where it becomes a bit more nebulous what the culture or rules are, but there is a kind of expectation of coherence. People expect family to be family, at least in places where family matters. Some genres it might not, but be it a mafia family or just a small extended family in some fantasy setting, they have a kind of connection to this particular group. And some families may have connections with each other that are strong enough that they almost become a bigger faction. As for bigger factions, um, for lack of a better word, I call it a super faction when a lot of factions are part of a larger structure. That could be various government bureaus like the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, the ATF, Homeland Security, TSA, and so on, who are all basically factions of their own, but they're all part of the government. So the government becomes a kind of super faction. There's a faction that might not be that present in the day to day events, but they all do belong to it, and they do know that they have to adhere to the requirement of that faction. In a fantasy setting, for example, it could be a lot of guilds and trade houses and local families and aristocracy, um, and even something like the city guard or a night post or something, that are all individual factions that may have whatever qualms or friendships they have with one another, but they all are part of the city. So if something involves the whole city, they will be considered one faction. They will be expected to work together to some degree at least. Some of them may not be expected as much. Some, especially someone like the Thieves Guilds or like that, would not be as helpful. But a lot of them would be considered this city in the grander scheme of things. But inside the city, or when things are not citywide importance, they are their own little factions. Now, what is important about factions when thinking in intrigue maps and relations? The basics is that a faction is something that any individual might call upon in a time of need or a time of opportunity. Someone who is threatened by someone else might call up their family, might call up their guild, might report them um, to someone that they know will listen to them. They may bring in a faction that will automatically, if not take their side outright, at least listen to them and pay them some degree of respect and attention. They are, to some extent, an insider of a larger group, but the larger group is not constantly present. The whole group isn't present. The whole group is something that can be called upon. So that's kind of the basics of it. But when you go beyond that, a group or a faction has its own interests, and as I mentioned, it has its own rules to play by. So anything that could be of interest to an individual person, and many things that probably wouldn't, could have an interest to a faction in general, which means that a lot of events and places and people coming along could have some kind of connection through that faction. Um, the three different local bandits that you run into and need to deal with aren't just local bandit 1, local bandit 2, local bandit 3. No, they are all members of the same thieves guild, And when you start messing with one, you indirectly mess with others. And if something is of interest to the Thieves Guild in general, then all these three, even though they should probably all be fighting to get the thing they want individually, they are likely to more or less work together because they are part of a faction. The faction causes things to come crawling out of the woodwork which should not usually be connected, but they now are, and should not logically behave in highly similar ways, but they now do because they all have the faction culture and they all have the expectations of the faction hanging over their head. In the reverse, individuals may also have interests within a faction. One of the immediate ones is to gain respect, status, or rank, or the like within a faction. Someone that is part of a company faction might be chasing that next big promotion. There could be disagreements about whether the faction is chasing its goals in the right way. Maybe everybody agrees that the goals of a trade house is to build up a repertoire in a certain town, but something that should be done via just taking over the marketplace with all kinds of goods, while others feel that it should be something done politically, and others think that the right way to do it is through the black markets. And there will be disagreements that have to be settled within the faction culture. That faction culture may be cutthroat, so everybody just wants their thing to be done. It may be cooperative, so that everybody sits down and talks it out. And it may be anything between, and it may also be other things. The important thing is that people within a faction will not act entirely independently, but they also rarely act entirely along faction lines. There are usually some personal attitudes about the faction. Now, this can be kind of interesting if people belong to more factions or have some kind of relations to different factions, because factions also tend to have relations to one another. Maybe not as complicated as individual persons, as discussed last time, but one faction may not want another to succeed because they are competitors or because one would stand in the way of another. Some factions may cooperate because they have common interests. Some factions may even cooperate because the people in each faction have amicable connections to one another. They actually like each other, so they want their factions to cooperate. Sometimes the factions weren't meant to, but whoever in the faction is not interested in it still does it because they know that a lot of faction members want this to happen and they want the faction to work the best it can. Faction resources also tend to come into play especially when you go into higher intrigue storylines, because a faction almost by default has access to more resources than individual people, especially with individual people within the faction. So once the faction is interested in something, any individual who brought it to their attention might suddenly see a bunch of resources thrown their way, but they may also see other people come along and tell them how to do things. Suddenly it all becomes a part of something bigger. And the faction relation map can sometimes be made entirely separate from any individual, any personal relation map. And in high intrigue, probably should, because the faction map will bring in a lot more people, in the sense that each faction is a bunch of people, and thus spread a lot wider than any realistic personal relation map could ever do. So the personal relation map is more centered around the things that are important to the story, where a faction relation map is more a part of the world, the background, to explain why factions react to things in certain ways. So you may have a faction map that covers everything that happens in a whole small city, but you only have a personal relation map that covers about 20 people that are involved in whatever story you're dealing with. So yeah, factions aren't just groups of people. They add to the intrigue by adding to the people that may or may not be members of it, or may have different relations to the factions. Maybe someone is not a fan of the faction, or the faction isn't a fan of that person. There could be hostilities between factions and individuals, just as there could between factions and factions, or between individuals and individuals. And having a relation with a faction overall usually means having a either simple or complex, that varies, but having a relation to everybody in that faction, more or less. So it's a collective relation in many ways. But I'll keep it here because I think the battery is running out, and that does cover the things that I mainly wanted to say about factions. If there's more to it, I'll return. Factions play other roles than just intrigue, so I'll probably get back to them at some point. But factions can make for interesting intrigue, both on their own and when mixed in with personal relations.